So what they might refer to as a generator is really just transform. Okay. So what the purpose for the transformer is to, depending on which one we're looking at, it will either increase or decrease. And that will be your what we refer to as variable resistor. That's your auto transformer. Or it will only increase or only decrease, right? All right. So Faraday's law, the different portions of Faraday's law. What we're trying to accomplish in a transformer is to use magnetic fields to create electricity. All right. So a lot of different ways we can create electricity. Of course, we can use batteries, but in order to get the kind of voltage we need, we'd have to use a lot of batteries, right? And really, it's specialized batteries, because really, if we stack batteries, most likely the thing that we're going to get is going to be, instead of increased voltage, we're going to get increased amperage, right? So we have to have a way to manipulate that. So what we have then is the ways that we can create electricity is with magnetic field, right? So did you kind of get how it is that we can create it with a stationary magnet, with a magnet, just a magnet, not a magnetic field itself? Okay. Okay. So just to be sure, as we move a magnetic field close to a wire, then what we're going to get is an electric field, right? An electric current. So the electric current is going to be proportional to the magnetic field, how strong the magnetic field is, and how often we make that movement, right? So if we take just a regular magnet and we move it along, a coil of wire, then we're going to create an electric current. Trash can back there? Yeah. Here, throw this in it. Would you? I don't want to grab it again. I didn't mean to try to put out an eye. All right. So I don't want to grab that again. We tend to hang on to those things way too long. So anyway, if we have a magnet and we move it along any kind of wire, we're going to create electricity. It's going to be very weak electricity, but it's going to happen, right? So the way that we can increase the amount of electricity that we create is to increase the strength of the magnet, increase how often we move it, right? The direction that we move it and all that kind of stuff is secondary to movement, strength, okay? For our purposes anyway. So what we know then is that a electric current, on in motion, a electron moving through a wire creates two things. So as we move the magnet, we create electricity, and that electricity moving along the wire creates two things, one being heat and the other being a magnetic field. All right. So not only as I move this do I create a magnetic field, but in the moving of that, creating the electric current, I create a magnetic field. So I've now got two magnetic fields, right? So using that, we create more electricity with a stronger magnet. If I were to take this magnetic field, the secondary magnetic field, and coil it up, then what I get is overlapping magnetic field lines, and it's kind of like I've taken two magnets and I've smacked them together. I've made a bigger, stronger magnet. Okay. Still, I have issues with the loss of the magnetic field, because they're going to have a tendency to just want to swirl around each one of these little circles. So if I fill that in then with an iron core, and it's more specifically a laminated iron core, and the physics behind that is just beyond what we need to know. All you need to know is a laminated iron core reduces loss in the transformer. That's all you need to know. So now what I've done is I've taken our individual magnetic fields in each one of those coils of wire and I've strengthened them. Okay, now I got a strong magnet, right? So then if I come along and I remove this permanent magnet and instead I plug this into the wall, and in the wall, what I've got is, plug in your voltage and amperage. It doesn't really matter, but it's traveling in and out in alternating current at 60 hertz, which means 60 times a second. So how did I increase the amount of electricity that I created? Two things: strength of the magnet being one, and the other was how fast you move it, right? So 60 times a second, is that pretty quick? Yeah, and you blink about that fast. When you're not thinking about blinking, you're blink about it's fast. It's really, really fast, right? So now electricity is going in and out 60 times a second. And what that does is it takes the magnetic, this is still a magnet, right? And magnets have two poles. And because of the direction of the electrons going in and out, what that does is it switches the polarity back and forth and back and forth. Okay, so we've got the North Pole down here when the electricity is coming in, and then the North Pole down here when the electricity is going out. So it flips it 60 times per second. So it's like taking a magnet and just spinning it. So now we got massive motion, right? We got massive motion. I've got my coiled wires to create a stronger magnetic field. So I'm using alternating current to create a magnetic field, and with that alternating current, uh, uh, with the circuit that I've created these little loops that we call turns. So it's like I've taken a lot of magnets and I've stuck them together. So I've created a massive magnet with a very strong field. But at the same time, it's like I'm spinning a magnet. Okay, you good with all that? Okay, so going back to what we were talking about before, I got, let's say, just a closed loop, and I get a magnet, and I move the magnet along that closed loop. What do I create? Two things: heat and electricity. And with the moving charge, I create a magnetic field, right? So if this magnetic field is changing in relationship to this, creating electric flow, then what happens if, ignoring that, we'll take that off, what happens then, the same thing is happening over here with 60 hertz. I've taken electricity, I've created a magnetic field. So then what happens if I put another coil here? Would that same phenomenon happen if I've got that changing magnetic field in this coil of wire? Would I create electricity in this one? Yes. The answer is yes. Right. Now it's also going to create a magnetic field, but what we're interested in here is not the magnetic field, just the current. Okay. So I'm going to create current here because what I've got is a changing magnetic field changing at 60 hertz, 60 times a second. It's like I'm spinning. This no longer is a coil of wire creating electricity. It's just a magnet. For our purposes, all it is a magnet. Do I have electricity? Yes, I have electricity. But for our purposes, all this is at this point is a spinning magnet. Okay? So you're with me there. So with that spinning magnet, I'm going to create electricity on the secondary side. But not only can I create electricity in the secondary side, but if I change the resistance in the secondary side, I change the thickness of the coil wire. You saw the thing that I sent around, the filament transformer I sent around. If I change that, and I can change the number of coils of wire instead of having, I always draw this before I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That never happens. 10 coils. So if then I've got, instead of 10 coils of wire on the second one, I've got, let's say 100, was 10 there, I've got 100 here, then the magnetic field that I create here reaches out and it goes through the secondary coil wire, and we can create electricity in that secondary coil wire. And if I have more turns on that secondary than I had on the primary, then my voltage goes up. Okay. So I've got a turns ratio of 1 to 10. That means that my voltage is going to go up by a factor of 10. If I had 1 to 1,000 or 10 to 1,000, that would mean that my voltage would go up by 100, right? And if I had 10,000, 1,000, yeah. And if I had 100,000, that'd be 10,000. Okay, so it's a direct relationship. If I only had 10 coils here and 10 coils there, I accomplished nothing effective. So input voltage, output voltage are going to be identical, give or take such a small amount of loss that it for our purposes doesn't matter.
And is that the same as the turns ratio?
That is the turns ratio. This is the turns ratio. So in most of our current machines, our turns ratio is going to be in the thousands, 10,000s. It's going to be enormous. The filament transformer that I sent around last week, really the only thing that we're trying to accomplish is to take our voltage from, it might be 120, it might be 220, but I'm just trying to reduce it down to 25. So that turns ratio doesn't need to be drastic, but in the high voltage transformer, what I'm taking is voltage from 220, 240, let's say. I'm trying to boost it up to maybe 110,000. So it's got to be big. We have to, our turns ratio may be as dramatic as 1 to 30 to 50,000. It's going to be big. Okay. So Faraday's law, just to kind of sum it up tightly, is for our purposes, we're taking a magnetic field that's generated by alternating current and creating a secondary electric flow, or an electric flow in a secondary coil, for the sole purpose of either increasing or decreasing voltage depending on the turns ratio. So if the turns ratio is reversed, let's say this is my primary, then my voltage is going to decrease, right, according to turns ratio. If I'm going from, if this is primary and this is secondary, my voltage is going to increase, right? So we have really fundamentally 4 different transformers, right? We have the auto transformer, which we're going to talk about deeper to maybe today if we have time. And it's a variable transformer. It's a variable resistor. You can turn it up, you can turn it down. It works off of this is what we refer to as mutual induction. We take electric flow to create a magnetic field, a changing magnetic field, because it's alternating current, a changing magnetic field to induce an alternating current in the secondary coil. Mutual induction. This one induces electricity and this one induces electric flow in this one. Okay, mutual induction. But an auto transformer only has one coil of wire. And so it operates in the exact same way, except for it only has that one coil of wire, and it uses what we refer to as self-induction. So we're going to, instead of having 2 separate coils of wire, we have one coil of wire with a lot of taps on the secondary side, and depending on which one of those taps we use, or which ones of those taps we use, we can either increase or decrease voltage. Okay, we're gonna get deeper into the auto transformer later on. I just want that primed that the auto transformer works off the exact same law as a step up, step down transformer. So we have the auto transformer as one. We have the step up transformer as one, and the step up transformer was, okay, let's back up to this. Auto transformer steps up or down voltage, depending on where we put the contacts on the secondary side. So it can go up or go down. Step up transformer only goes in one direction. That is increase in voltage. Right? We're going to increase voltage on a magnitude of thousands. Step down transformer has a turns ratio where the primary side is greater than the secondary side, so voltage goes down, right? And then you've got the MA selector, which really works off the same thing. It's they talk about it being precision resistors, and I mean that's true. That's the same thing with these, but if they're going to call it a rheostat, it works off really the same principle as the auto transformer. Right, so you got auto transformer, you got MA selector, you got step up, step down transformers, all pretty much working off the same principle, and that is primary side alternating current. Right, sets up a changing magnetic field. Secondary side, we induce electric current depending on that turns ratio.
So you're gonna ask for like eddy current? Is that one sky filament?
Yeah. To increase the efficiency, we'd add an iron core to reduce eddy currents. Okay, does that help at all? It did help. Okay. Yeah.
So is the secondary also alternating?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's it going if it doesn't.
What's that? I drew this sideways. Yeah.
Okay.
So, usually I draw it like this. I don't know why I got started that way. Two things that have never happened in all of my years of teaching this classes. I've never drawn this sideways. That's number one. Number two, I've never come up with an even number that I didn't have to add or subtract a coil of wire to make it easier. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm just all over the place today, which is the same as every other day. Right.
So, also like with it being magnetized, you have to have an atom with that's ionic, so it's an odd number of
That's really a good question, and I don't. I would have to look into because it's usually going to be copper. So I'd have to look at the atomic number of copper and see, but really we're supplying the electrons from a generator. So really more than anything else, what we need are loosely bound electrons on that on the whatever material we're using for the conductor. And whether or not there's an odd number, yeah, I really couldn't tell you.
So that's not like a test thing just talked about like charged particles in motion. They have to have an odd number of, or they have to have an odd number of electrons.
Yeah, no, the unpaired electron, in as much as a circuit, no. There may be a question on there that asks something specific about unpaired electrons and an atom and its propensity to be to exhibit magnetic properties, but not in this context. That's just in general. What else?
Do we need the shell types?
Yeah. So open core, least efficient. Closed core would be more efficient. That would be just square, and then that cinder block looking thing is shell type. And it's what we use mainly now. Is more efficient than the other two. So one thing I was thinking about when I was getting ready for class this morning was that we talked about solenoids and where we use them in a hospital. When we talked about the door locks, right? The doors are held open unless there's fire alarm, and then the doors automatically close. But we use them in the imaging system as well. Like whenever you move the control tower, the X-ray tube and the tower itself, whenever you squeeze the handles or push the buttons to enable you to move it up and down or, the length of the table, you're actually activating solenoids. So the default position for those, let's say we've got a rail here. Each one of those cross sets of rails, next time you're in clinicals or in a lab, just look up at the ceiling. And what you'll see is 4 rails. All right, so the rails, one set of rails is stationary, and they go the length of the room. Right? So they go all the way from one end of the room. In our lab, you got this dead space over here. The X-ray table is here. You got that space over there, and then the door is like right here, right? So the door is right there. And then the sink is over here, right? So you got this one set of rails that goes all the way across the room, and then you got a secondary set of rails that ride on that. And then the tower, the X-ray tube, and all that apparatus ride on this one, right? So what you've got in the imaging system is you've got riding on these rails over here, you got a set of solenoids. And you can actually hear them activate if you push the buttons. You hear that clack. All right, so what they've got is maybe a strong set of springs or whatever, mashing brakes up into this, in this control tower. It may work exactly in the opposite direction, but let's say this is how it works. Is you've got this strong set of brakes that are pushing, these springs that are pushing up into this set of rails to hold them in place. When you hit the button to move your control tower so that you can drag your tube across the room, what it does is it draws those back and it releases the brakes so you can move it. Okay? And it's just solenoid. It's alternating current through a coil of wire to create a magnetic field to draw those brakes down and away from those, rails. Same thing in the control tower itself. You squeeze a handle, you push the buttons, you'll hear that clack and you can move it. But if you don't push the button, don't do this because, we don't have the budget to, fix it if you go in and strip the brakes off this thing. But you can give it a little bump and you can feel how strong the brakes are on these things. It just doesn't move. As a matter of fact, that tower is very heavy. The X-ray tube in its protective housing probably weighs just that portion of it, probably weighs that machine up there around 80, 90 pounds. Right? I mean, it's not like you're going to kill yourself picking it up, but it's pretty heavy, suspended from the ceiling. Now you add in all that other stuff, you got some weight there. So it's pretty strong, but they're activated with solenoids. Same thing with the table. The table's probably not as strong as what these are, because in a lot of your tables, if you lean up against it, anybody done that? Either in clinicals or in lab? Yeah, it'll move out from under you in some cases. So, but it's the same thing. They're activated with solenoids. So where we use solenoids, not just in the doors, but to move the table, or to move the table and also to move the tower as well. They should have preferred areas where they stop, and that's in this chapter. That's what we're referred to as the detents. You let go of it, it locks into place where it is that you're, at 72 inches, 40 inches, whatever. Okay, so just electromagnets, fundamentally. So I don't think anybody asked that question, but now you know. All right, any other questions? Okay. All right, then let's start on chapter 6 with the X-ray imaging system. All right, so we've got a number of different orientations of imaging systems that you'll see and you have seen. And those imaging systems are identified by a couple of different things, and sometimes a combination of different things. So you've got X-ray systems that are identified by the energy that they produce. In diagnostic, what that would mean would be like your fluoro units. tend to work off a high kVp and low mass, or at least low MA. The overall mass is determined by whoever's running the machine, and the longer he energizes the X-ray tube, right? So what you might have started talking about in imaging in intro is that when selecting between a couple of different techniques, how you can reduce the patient's dose is by using a higher kVp and a lower mass technique. Have you covered that at all? Okay. Well, think about how much time that you've seen a fluoro unit being energized. How long the longest time somebody stood on that pedal was. And if in that particular procedure, if they were using a low kVp, they would naturally have to have a high mass. So with a high mass, what you get is a lot of exposure to the patient. Remember, your three primary types of interaction inside the patient: compton scatter, and that's where your dose comes from; straight penetration without any kind of interaction, and that leaves no dose to the patient. It just goes through and hits the image receptor. But the majority of the patient dose comes from photoelectric interaction. That's total absorption, right? So what controls your penetration and the likelihood of penetration? KVP, right. So what you're going to learn, and we're going to talk about next semester, really fundamentally is this: as KVP goes up, the likelihood of any kind of interaction inside the patient decreases. Okay. We're going to stress a little bit of a twist on that, and that is that as KVP goes up, scatter radiation goes up, but that's really a percentage thing that we'll get into next semester. So file that away, that for right now, KVP goes up, scatter goes up. It really doesn't, and we'll kind of ferret that out next semester, but just, keep that in the back of your mind. And right now, just go with KVP goes up, scatter goes up. The same Nat that was in here on Monday. Monday is still in there. All right, so KVP. So your fluoro units naturally use high KVP and low MA. All right, so what do you, last time you shot anybody shot any extremity work? Okay, a couple of you. All right. So did you use that 100, 110 KVP for extremity work? No, you don't need that, because with that amount of penetration through a hand, fingers, stuff like that, you're going to over penetrate, right? So you need the ability in some cases to reduce your KVP. Is that going to be high mass exposure to the patient? No, you shouldn't do a hand, right? So energy level is one way. Fluoroscopy units use high KVP, naturally high KVP, to reduce patient dose, and also save heat on the X-ray tube, but reduce patient dose. Diagnostic systems have a wider range. Like Bushong says that the minimum energy on some, and he has to include a wide range because all manufacturers are not going to be the same, but minimum KVP 25. I think I've only ever worked on a few machines that you could get down to 25 KVP, because there's no reason to create an X-ray beam in a diagnostic room with 25 KVP ever, right? So most of the machines that you're going to use are probably going to be minimum KVP of 40. Mammo, on the other hand, there is a reason to shoot at 25 KVP, but there's never a reason to use a diagnostic room to shoot mammo. We've got specialized rooms for that. All right, so mammo units, naturally low KVP. Diagnostic rooms, radiography rooms, only radiography rooms are going to be higher KVP, starting somewhere around 40 and going up to 150. You're also not going to use 150. And then what we refer to as RF rooms, they have a kind of a combination of a couple of different things. One is fluoroscopy, and it can be, high KVP, low MA, but they've also got the same capabilities as a radiography, a diagnostic radiography. So what we refer to them as are RF rooms, radiography and fluoroscopy rooms. Okay. So any kind of exam that you need to take in diagnostic radiology, you can complete in that. Upper GI, from fingers and hands all the way up to upper GIs, lumbar punctures, things like that. So you should be familiar with those last two, just your radiography rooms and your RF rooms, right? Mammography, if you rotate through mammography in your second year, then you'll see those rooms as well. So in that context, we can refer to them by the energy they create: high kVp, fluoroscopy, diagnostic, or we can refer to them as the function that they put out, be it a radiography room or a general RF room. Okay, so regardless of what type of room we have, we're going to have four basic components. So what you use to make your exposure, the thing that you have to set up is what we refer to as control panel. And we've got the X-ray tube, and then we have the high voltage generation system. So again, now we're back to calling it generation as opposed to just transformer. So when we're talking about high voltage generation system, we're talking about the entire thing where we're going to generate the high voltage. We're not going to generate electricity that's coming to us from a power plant. We're going to generate the high voltage. Okay. So don't let that confuse you. It's not that we've got a generator, we've got transformers, and we've got all kinds of different stuff. Okay. So what we do from the control panel is fundamentally two different things. We control really fundamentally one thing, and that is to control the exposure to the patient. But the exposure to the patient is going to be the control of the quantity and the quality of the X-ray beam. Okay, so this is about as basic of a control panel as what I can find. What are components on this is far more basic than what you probably see in clinicals. Most of the time in clinicals and our modern machinery, you push a button that corresponds to the image that you want to create. So you're taking an X-ray of a chest, you push the chest button. You want to make an image of a hand, you push the hand button, right? But this is pretty bare bones. Let me get rid of some light so we can kind of focus on these things. So when we're talking about quantity of X-rays, we're just talking about the number of electrons we send across the tube. That directly impacts the number of X-rays that we create. In next semester, we're going to hammer that pretty hard and talk about all the different things that can control that quantity. That is not going to show up on there at all. All right. But I'll post this picture, along with the video, or link to this picture along with the video. So what we have then in our control of quantity, our primary control of quantity, and it's very important that you understand it's primary control, not total control, is our mass. All right. So what is mass? It's milliamperage. And what is amperage? It's just a count of electrons, right? That's all it is, just a count of electrons. So 1 amp is a ridiculous number of electrons. We use milliamps. So we have two different things to control our overall amperage in being representative of the number of electrons we send across the tube, and that is our MA and our time. KVP also controls our numbers, and we'll talk about that next semester. Right now, all you need to be thinking about is control of numbers, or intensity or quantity, being MA and time. All right, so MA times time gives us our overall mass, and that is our count of electrons that we send across the tube. That's all it is. It's quantity as opposed to KVP is our quantity, or our quality, our measure of quality. And kind of equate this, what are we trying to accomplish in X-ray? Take an X-ray beam, generate an X-ray beam, and what are we trying to do with that X-ray beam?
Get it through the patient.
Through is the key word here. All right. You see the bones in my skull? No. Why? Same type of energy, electromagnetic energy, right? It's just not high enough energy, right? So, in as much as making an X-ray of my skull, is that of any quantity or quality at all? The answer is no. Okay, so low energy X-ray photons, the upper registry of non-ionizing X-rays. So I think I read somewhere that the lowest energy X-ray photon is actually not in kilovoltage range. So somewhere around, let's say 700 volts, right? Is that going to get through there? And if you think yes, you're greatly underestimating how hard my head is. Right? The answer is no, it's not. It's probably not going to penetrate the skin on my hand, right? So again, it's useless. In order to penetrate, we have to have high voltage, high kilovoltage. We have to have very high voltage. Otherwise, it's useless. So KVP equals quality. Okay. So KVP is quality. MA and time together create mass, and that is our quantity, our direct control quantity. But we got a lot of other things to consider in a control panel as well. Your control panel looks a whole lot more complicated than this, but at the same time, it's simpler. You push a button for chest X-ray, you push a button for abdomen or whatever. So on a control panel like this, we have to set all that stuff. Okay, so we're going to talk about some things here, and it's not going to follow the same order as the chapter. So I'll try to kind of draw it all back in towards the end of the lecture. So these three things down here, you ever seen anything that looks kind of like those? What's that? On the IR. That's exactly what they are. Those are representative of the radiation detectors inside your wall bucky. You don't generally see that on a table bucky, but those are representative of what you see on the wall bucky. Inside the wall bucky, what you have is radiation detectors in a couple of different formats that we'll talk about here in a bit, but or probably not until Wednesday of next week. Different types of radiation detectors, but what those are is what we refer to as phototimers. Okay, so we have a lot of different types of timers, and we're going to walk through each one of those, but we're going to talk about these specifically right now because it's in this chapter. And what these are is just radiation detectors that are tied to a timer circuit, and it takes some of the guesswork out of selecting technique. By the time you graduate, you should be really familiar with technique, but you might not be comfortable with technique. Okay, it's something we can't really teach all that well. We can tell you a range, but in as much as you're trying to figure out what you specifically would use on every X-ray, you've got to come to that yourself. And the reason I say that is because, what you're going to do is you're going to look at your patient, you're going to see your patient as a representation of you. All right. So I got a hand. So you got a hand on a person about your same size. You're going to have a technique in mind for your own hand, and that's the technique you're going to use on that patient with the same size hand as you have. My representation is going to be totally different from yours. My hand is going to be totally different from yours. So your large might be different from my large. So you've got to figure out what your own techniques are. We can't really give you good techniques. You got to figure that out at some point. But if you're shooting into the table bucky, hands and feet and toes and fingers are going to be pretty similar, right? Regardless of how big the patient is. But how about abdomen? That's all over the place, right? You'll have somebody who's asthenic and their abdomen is this thick. Pediatric patients, and then you've got your basic East Texan, and we got a gun, right? Love a buffet, So The problem there then is that on that pediatric patient, you may need 6 mass, pretty low mass. But on a hypersthenic patient, you may need 80. You may need 100, you may need 150. And how do you land on that? It's tough, right? So to take some of that guesswork out, they've created this, and this is what we refer to as automatic exposure control. All right, so you make an exposure on an abdomen, then you can set these radiation detectors, and those radiation detectors are designed to take a certain amount of radiation and terminate the exposure, completely kill the exposure when they receive the right amount of radiation. So let's say it's not an abdomen, because you can have a number of configurations for an abdomen. What you want to do is you want to put the anatomy of interest directly over the photocell that you're using. Okay, so if you're shooting a APL spine, okay, where's your APL spine? Where should it be?
Lower center.
Yeah, it should be right at the middle line of your body, right? So naturally, you would want to use that center cell. I know we hadn't started into L spines yet, but if we're only interested in seeing the L spine, what should you do? Should you shoot just like KUB? Well, in some cases, yes, and we'll talk about that as well. But according to the textbook, no, you shouldn't. You should collimate in, right? So where are these on your wall buttons? They're way outside, right? So your automatic exposure control, your photocell configuration for an AP of the L spine should just be that one right there. Okay. So next time you're in clinical, start playing with your control panel and take a look. You should have some representation of that on your control panel. Lights light up. You push a KUB, and you may have these two light up. You may have all three of them light up. You switch over to an APL spine and just the center one. You switch over to chest X-ray, just these outer two. Okay. All right. So how those work again is that they receive radiation, and when they get to a preset amount of radiation, they send a signal over to the timer circuit to discontinue the time. So what are our two components of mass? MA and time. MA is going to be set, right? When you push that button that says chest X-ray, MA is going to be set. It's going to energize those. Your overall mass is going to be dependent on your patient's body habits. So if they're set to receive a certain amount of radiation, you have an asthenic patient. How long is it going to take for the proper amount of radiation to get through a little bitty skinny chest X-ray? Not long. You have somebody who's great big, and what's going to happen? It's going to take longer. So the MA is set. Skinny patient, what's your overall mass? Determined by time. Only time, right? So you have the big patient, the mass is going to be higher, determined only by time, because the MA is set. Okay? So that's how phototimers work. If you are working on those, preset, it's what we'll refer to as automatically programmed radiography. You would have to set those. Okay. If you're doing a tabletop technique, you'd have to select your KVP, your MA, and time. All right. So what have we been through? That. Okay. All right. So transthoracic proximal humerus. What do we do? Positioning wise, we put the anatomy of interest closest to the image receptor. We elevated the side that we didn't want to see. But what did we do with our technique? Okay, we had to go up, right, from a shoulder technique. But what did we want to not see prominently in our X-ray? The lungs. So how did we accomplish getting the lungs out? Longer time, shorter or lower MA, right? So MA, we drop our MA, increase our time, right? If we were setting a technique. So would that work if we were phototiming? Yeah, you could reduce your MA. and you could increase your time. So there's been a couple of times that I've referenced density controls. You remember talking about that? I said +1, -1. You remember talking about that? Okay, sometimes, and I didn't take this into consideration when I mentioned those, sometimes those density controls are not represented by +or -1. They're represented by the size, a picture of different size, cartoon characters, right? So look at the top, way up there. What do you see up there? Yeah, different size people. They kind of have them out of order, it seems like to me. I guess the one on the far left is maybe pediatric. We've got small, medium, large, maybe. I don't know. That's what that's supposed to be, is representation of that. So what those do is they're tied back into these. So what if we're taking a transthoracic humerus? So we've got a broken humerus. It's probably osteoporotic. It's going to be hard to put the humerus of interest directly over the photocell. So you might have some variability where primarily what you have is lung over the photocell. Okay. So how could you set that photocell to where it receives more radiation before it terminates the exposure? With those things or the plus or minus buttons. Okay. So what are we doing with all this? I mean, why am I talking about all this? What are you doing with each one of those things I just mentioned? Setting technique, which specifically is changing your KVP, MA, and time separately so that you change your quality and the quantity of x-rays you create. So you give a patient the proper dose. Same thing with these things, providing you position properly. So I worked in hospitals that took two totally different approaches to automatic exposure control. One is use AECs on everything that you can possibly use AECs on. Okay. So what do you think the most important thing is, and the thing that the department should stress accuracy in departments where they use AECs for everything? What do you need over the photocell? MA is what you're going to have, and time is going to be determined by the photocell. But what specifically, I'm going to give this away just in the wording of this, what specifically should you have positioned over the photocell? The anatomy of interest, the patient, and the anatomy of interest. So when you're phototiming, what is the most important thing? Positioning. Yeah, you have to position accurately in order for these things to work right. And I've worked in hospitals that's, they say, well, you got a whole lot more flexibility if you don't use the photocells. You have more flexibility in your position, which is true. But what do you have to know if you're not going to use photocells? Technique. Right. So why do you suppose it is that we have on your first, second, third level checkoffs different expectations for setting technique? Your first one, what do you have to do? So just don't blow it, pretty much, and that's by design. We want to build your confidence, and I don't mean that disparagingly. It's just that it's impossible to get through this without repeating a lot of x-rays. Back when we used screens and films, 8% was the professional acceptable repeat rate. That means that for people, seasoned technologists, almost 1 out of every 10 x-rays that we created was garbage. And part of that was because of technique, right? But technique, some of the variables in technique have loosened up a little bit because of the computer processing. But still probably 5% or possibly more. So we expect y'all to mess up a lot of x-rays. So as a result, we don't expect just a tremendous amount on your first checkoff. Is the anatomy on there, and is it rotated? Do you have everything there? But what's your second level? You got to pay attention to what it shoots, and you got to document that, right? You might not have looked forward to the third level yet, but what do you suppose you got to do? Set your technique, right? So the reason that should be documenting your technique is on your second level, which should start next semester, is so that you can start learning and building your own technique chart in your mind. What do I consider to be an average KUB? What do I consider to be average chest X-ray? That sort of thing, so that you can turn those off for your third level, and hopefully, make a good X-ray with a set technique that you've started to develop. Okay, so control panel outside of the room, behind a protective barrier, is where your control panel should be. Right? So control panel controls quantity or quality of your X-ray beam. Other things I did not point out, focal spot size. You can select different focal spots. We'll talk about that, I think, in the next section. But you control the X-ray beam completely at your control panel, right? And it should be outside of the room. Some of your machines will actually let you set technique on the X-ray tube itself, but the control panel is outside of the room. If you ever notice, though, that in a lot of your rooms, the wall, the protective wall, is full of lead, by the way. That protective wall does not go all the way to the ceiling. You ever seen that? Is that a problem? I'm getting some yeses. Is it? Where's your dose come from? Patient, right? So the patient's here on the table, right? Patient's there on the table, and your control panel is over here, right? And then the ceiling is up here, and you're standing right there. So the dose has to come off of the patient and travel, I don't know, between 6 and 10 feet to get to you. What can you not do with X-rays?
You can change the direction.
Can't change it. What is that? It's refraction, essentially, right? So you're not going to refract it and make it bend down like that. So in order for the X-ray to get you coming off that patient, it'd have to scatter there, it'd have to hit the ceiling and then scatter, it'd have to hit the wall behind you and scatter, and then hit you. Is that going to happen? Statistically,
Probably not.
almost not. I mean, theoretically, could it? Theoretically, anything can happen, right? Statistically speaking, is it going to happen? No, you're perfectly fine behind this. But what about that big glass thing? Glass transmit X-rays? They will. It's leaded glass, though. Okay, what do you know about lead? Pretty efficient at blocking X-rays. All right, so I don't recommend this. So I worked in a hospital, and the setup of the X-ray room was not very tech friendly. We got blasted all the time. We didn't really know it until we noticed some scatter radiation was exposing some X-rays that we'd already taken. And the only way that we noticed that was because somebody was holding an X-ray film, and we shot a PHS X-ray and we shot the lateral, and we could see his arms going across the image whenever we processed the image. A lot of scatter bouncing around this X-ray room. So it got me to thinking, how much radiation we're taking in this room. So I did a lot of experimentation, and some of the processes that we used, where we did our cross-table laterals, chest X-rays, T-spines, things like that, we were taking a massive dose. And it got me thinking, that's glass. Sometimes you'll do a trauma patient, and the patient will be covered in glass. Sometimes you'll see the glass, sometimes you will not. So X-rays go through glass pretty easy. So I took X-ray film and I smashed it up against the window and I shot directly into my hand. thinking, I'm just gonna take a massive dose. And I got nothing on the x-ray film. All right. In your sophomore year, you're gonna be doing some experiments, and our image receptors now, what I'm finding is our image receptors now are so sensitive to that some of the things that I thought didn't happen do. Like I won't give this away, but hopefully you'll forget about it between now and then. But in that same set of experiments, I'd take films and I'd put the film on the table, and then I'd take the X-ray beam and I'd point it in all different directions to see how much leakage radiation, which we'll talk about. Leakage radiation is coming out of the protective housing. Protective housing should stop X-rays except for what's coming through the port. And the machinery I used, I could not find any leakage radiation. I thought protective housing is perfect, right? And I found out yesterday it's not. There's a lot of leakage radiation comes out of the X-ray tube. Okay, so you're thinking maybe, okay, well the X-ray is pointing that way, right? You're doing portables. I've got my lead apron on. If I stand behind the X-ray tube, I'm not getting any X-rays because all the X-rays going that way. And you would be wrong. So the leakage radiation limits, or the protective housing limits leakage radiation. Doesn't stop all of it. 110 kVp penetrates a whole lot more than what I used to think. I had a student one year that was doing his experiment was half value layer. And he used, this is way off on a rabbit trail, but he used lead aprons to see how many layers of lead aprons he could penetrate at 110 kVp. Want to guess? How many?
3.
8.
7.
Oh,
7 layers. So imagine how heavy one lead apron is. Right? One lead apron. So now imagine wearing 7 of them to stop. What kind of kVp did we use on fluoro? Our kVp.
man.
Right? So let's take it all the way back. How do you limit your radiation dose?
Inverse squared.
Okay, but because of the inverse square law, you've got 3 things. Time. So don't be in a room if you don't have to be. Distance, right? Step back away from the patient because that's where your dose is coming from. And shielding. So is lead apron useless? Well, no. Is 2 lead aprons better than 1? Some fat PA's body along with 2 lead aprons better than 1 lead apron? Yeah. So step back, step away from the patient, use whatever you have to. You're doing portables. I think I mentioned this before. You're doing portables, you're in a you're driving a battery powered portable. You can tell battery powered portables because they're motor driven. If yours doesn't have a motor that you have to engage to move it, it's not motor driven. Get out of the room. But if you're with a machine that whenever you get onto the elevator kind of protests a little bit and it goes did. There's a reason for that, and it's because it's full of batteries. Batteries have a lot of fluid in them, but they also have a lot of lead. So how do you reduce your dose if you're in a room? You're not going to penetrate batteries. You're not going to penetrate that battery-powered portable. So how can you reduce your dose if you're doing portables in a room? Stand behind it. Yeah, if it's a big dose, you're doing okay. So one of the scariest patients I ever had, we were having to do a decubitus abdomen on this woman, and she was as wide as the table, maxed out the portable machine, as high as it would go, right? Massive amounts of scatter radiation. Can't get far enough away from this thing. But the reason I say it was scary is because I was on the side of the table, told the patient to roll up towards me. I thought she was coming off the table. She'd have broken both of my legs. That big lady. So I'm not being insensitive. It's just, telling you as it is. So how do you get out of the way of that? What's that?
You can't.
Well, you can't completely. You can step back as far as you can, or if you're limited in as far back as you can get, driving that battery powered portable, duck, right? Get behind it. Tell the patient to hold their breath. You squat down. If you don't want to seem insensitive, drop that. Because it's going to be a long exposure, right? So protect yourself. That's the point here. Yeah. How do we shoot that? All over the place I am. Anybody know what time we started this fiasco? At 9:30 is what time we started up. Okay, well let's kind of finish this thought anyway. So 3 parts of the imaging system. We have the X-ray tube inside the room. We have the console outside of the room behind the protective barrier, and then we also have the high voltage generator, the generator system, and that might be in a couple of different places. If you go into our lab, I think I mentioned this the other day. You look in that back right corner, you can see it. Some places that have the room to store it, if they have a lot of ceiling space, it can be up at a false ceiling. Some of your low energy, lower output, it might actually be in the control panel, which again, the control tower rather, which again is just adding weight to it, because you got a lot of stuff in there that we're going to talk about as we go on. So let me see if there's anything else. Oh yeah. So you're also some things that will identify. Wow, we took a long walk. Some other things that will identify your system is how the tabletop moves. All right, so with a radiography room, what you've got are those solenoids, and what you have is what we refer to as a floating tabletop. So you step on the pedal, and the tabletop will go anywhere you want it to go. And we already established that if you lean on that tabletop will move. All right. So anybody done a lumbar myelogram or a cervical myelogram, let's say. Okay. So what do you do with cervical myelogram that you have not seen with any other procedure specifically? Now remember, you put the patient's feet in the boots, you strap them, you put the patient's feet in the boots and you strap them onto the footboard of the table, and we'll talk more about that later on. But you strap them onto the footboard of the table, and you'll take that table and you'll tilt it so that their head is down. It's in Trendelenburg to try to get that contrast to run up into the C-spine. Okay? So now imagine you've got a floating tabletop with those solenoids that might not hold the table completely still. You got this patient on the tabletop, and they're not strapped into the boots, and the tabletop starts sliding. Is it going to stop eventually? Yeah, it's going to go thunk, and then what's the patient going to do? You're going to be doing a skull series, right? They're going to come off of the table onto the floor. So floating tabletops are good for radiography rooms, not good for fluoroscopy. So you go into clinicals tomorrow, you go to lab today, you're going to see floating tabletop. You go into clinicals tomorrow, go into an RF room and see how the tabletop moves. It's going to be motor driven, so that whenever you're not driving the motor, it's solid. It's not going anywhere. All right. Another distinguishing characteristic is that those RF rooms are going to have that ability to tilt. You're doing an upper GI barium swallow, you might want to start with the patient standing up. All right, so the table will go 90 degrees in one direction, so the patient's standing up, right? So fluoro tower is here, patient is here, they're standing, they're leaning, standing on that foot piece, right? So standing on a foot piece, as you're setting your room up, you're getting ready for an upper GI or barium swallow or something like that, where you're going to start with the patient standing up. The first thing you have to do is put that foot piece on. Second thing you have to do is make sure that foot piece is on there solid, right? So you shake it and try to knock it loose. And if it doesn't come loose, then it's good. The problem is, you put a patient on that and it's not locked into place. The patient steps on it, it's going to the floor, and probably the patient is too. That might land on their foot. Now you get a lawsuit, right? So make sure it's on there. But fluoro tables are going to have some degree of tilt. In one direction, they're going to go 90 degrees. In the other direction, they're not going to go so much. I've worked in a system where it would go into Trendelenburg very steeply, and it was like what we would refer to as a 90-60 room. So go 90 degrees in one direction so the patient can stand upright, but it go into 60-degree Trendelenburg. That's pretty steep. Most of them are only going to go 30, 40 degrees into Trendelenburg. Okay. But that's going to identify the degree of tilt of the table in fluoro rooms. Doesn't apply to radiography rooms, general radiography, basic radiography rooms, just general diagnostic rooms that do fluoroscopy and radiography. Okay. So I got to the first page I got through most of the first page of the notes I had for today. Any questions on all that?
Do we know how many questions?
This test, I think there's 72. That's right. Well said, 72. All right. Well, don't wash away. They're predicting a lot of rain between now and whenever. I hope